Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Firewall, the business bycast, where tech meets business. Get expert insights and real-world business leaders, IT experts, and the latest trends in bite-sized episodes. Stay ahead and explore what's beyond the firewall. And welcome back, everybody, to Beyond the Firewall, where we don't just talk about technology, we bring business leaders and great new ideas to the forefront. And today, I actually have a very special guest, Pina from CITT. Pina, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
For sure. Thanks very much for having me, Erez. My name's Pina Melchionna. I'm the president of the CITT, which is a very long-winded way to say Canada's Logistics Association. We're a professional community of individuals and businesses in and around logistics. Over the last decade in particular, and especially since COVID, more and more business leaders and our government have actually come to recognize and understand the strategic importance of the supply chain with respect to the competitiveness of our industries and the standard of living of Canadians across the country. Our mission is manifold. We aim to train logistics professionals to the highest standard, empowering them to make their organizations and our country more competitive. But we also act as a bit of a networking hub where we bring leaders and stakeholders from across the industry to share their ideas across common challenges in the environment and if nothing else, professional camaraderie rather than competitiveness, because we all know that the supply chain is so interconnected, and unless you start to build those relationships, those are the people that you rely on to make sure things go smoothly.
Wow, yeah, and when we look at supply chain since COVID, I think everybody had a rude awakening in respect to how critical shipping, logistics, 3PL, all that stuff was like critical to getting everything from groceries to essential goods. And I think we're seeing another round of that right now with the global crisis on what's going on between oil and everything else with the conflicts that are going on around the world. So it's
I'd
it's
agree.
constantly impacting.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there. It's a shame because, when I first joined this industry a number of years ago, my very early observation was that supply chain logistics has a PR problem. And the PR problem is that the better our folks are at their job, the more invisible they are. And it's only when something is broken, like in the middle of a global pandemic, when an ocean carrier gets stuck in a canal, when we have all of these issues going on globally. So when the supply chain is broken, that's when people start to pay attention to this industry that literally supports every other industry in the country.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you say that. And I would say in the last 6, 7 years, there's been so many incidences around, what was it, the Suez Canal or the
Yeah,
Panama Canal, where the ship went sideways and
yeah.
like for like a week, they couldn't get it unlodged, it was stuck in there and nothing can pass because the ship was literally horizontal to the canal. So like, it doesn't matter what kind of circumstance, if it's, from a geopolitical instability all the way to just a natural occurrence of an accident. These things impact every aspect of our lives and we take it for granted. So yeah, it's an interesting perspective of how critical, this conversation is to every aspect of our lives. So, you know, you kind of touched on it. And I'm a little bit interested in finding out today, but what would you say, let's say outside of the current, let's call it the war, outside of the war that's currently going on in the Middle East, what would you say is the biggest shift that's happening in supply chain today and logistics?
I have to say the biggest thing that I've seen since the pandemic, and including some of the things that are happening today, is the shift from just in time. And I think people know what that means. It means, that businesses create lean operations so that you receive your product, your good, or your materials just when you need it rather than
Right.
holding on to reserves, because that comes with a cost. So the terminology has changed from just in time to just in case. The unpredictability between COVID, the unpredictability of the US and tariffs, the geopolitical conflicts disrupting supply chains. I think a lot of organizations have now recognized that just in time is a vulnerability. And so what we're now seeing is global and Canadian supply chains are in the process of realigning and trying to find ways to stabilize that vulnerability and to create more resilient supply chains.
Couldn't agree with you more. I think we all became way too reliant on the Uberification and Amazonification of everything. I need something, I go on Amazon, I click a button, it's at my door by next morning. I need a meal, I click a button and my meal's there in 20 minutes or less type of thing. And I don't need to think about my groceries anymore. The reality is that when it's across the country or across the globe, the logistics of that is a lot more complicated between natural disasters or natural variations and other instabilities, and there's way more factors involved. I'm actually seeing now as well manufacturers now assemble and build new factories on other continents where prior to 5 years ago, it was all in one continent. And that's no longer the case, right? We're seeing global development on manufacturing to coincide with what you're saying about just in case. Now I have a factory producing some of our production in North America, so I don't need to rely exclusively on offshore production.
Yeah, and I would say so that's a great point, Erez. So I would say the other trend, I wasn't going to touch on it, but now that you've brought that up, is sort of the friend shoring or the near shoring, recognizing that there are vulnerabilities that we've created by outsourcing many aspects of our supply chain. And so many organizations are looking for like-minded individuals in terms of values, or I shouldn't say individuals, countries, or bringing supply chain circles back home. So, I've seen from a shift from outsourcing to near sourcing or friend sourcing, depending on the terminology that you want to use, but it definitely came with the realization that our supply chains are vulnerable when we've outsourced these critical competencies that we're relying on someone else in some other jurisdiction to take control of in place of ourselves. So I would say that was the other big shift that we've definitely seen. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and that alone, I think when you look at it, I think it has its new level of complexity because supply chain was, here's our factory halfway around the world for cost efficiencies, ship it by container to various countries around the world, and now we're done. Now we've got one to several factories worldwide producing products, and now you have to allocate resources and materials throughout. So I think the complexities of logistics are even getting more complicated, not less complicated with the new world that we're living in.
Yep, I'd agree.
So yeah, it's interesting. So, looking at businesses both from a, let's call it product business or companies on both sides of the perspective, where do you see companies now most vulnerable? Is it the warehousing? Is it transportation? Is it planning? Is it technology? Where do you see the vulnerability these days?
You know, I think their vulnerability exists in all of those areas, and it really comes down to planning. So I would say that elite logistics and supply chain professionals come to the table planning for contingencies if senior management gives them the latitude to do that. And I think that planning around those vulnerabilities is where logistics folks can actually add real value. The other early impression of the supply chain when I first joined this industry about a decade ago was that we treat supply chain or logistics as a cost center versus a competitive differentiator. And it's only those companies that look at it as a competitive differentiation and give the supply chain folks a table at the, room at the table to actually come forward with proactive ways to fix things before they get broken. That's where the real value comes in. So I would actually say that there's vulnerability in all through of those areas. I don't think disruption is behind us. In fact, if, the last few years has taught us anything, is that change is the only thing we can rely on in this area. So I think there is vulnerability in all of those areas: transportation, warehousing, planning, logistics. And I think that's where logistics professionals can actually add value. It's the forward planning and justifying the business case for investments in more diverse and resilient supply chains.
So interesting you say that. Do you see that as a still common issue with executives in management still getting it wrong in the sense that they're not bringing all those to the table today and they're underestimating the value?
I do believe so. You look at the companies that are doing well, and that are the companies that have put logistics front and center of what they do. So in addition to looking at your core competencies, how does supply chain, how does logistics, how does resiliency planning fit into that? So I think many leaders either, unless they're in a logistics business. So let's differentiate that, right? You have companies that are providing a good or a product and relies on logistics versus a company that is the logistics provider. So I think that companies look at logistics a little too narrowly. They define resilience as carrier diversity or supplier diversity. And I think what I'd like to see is a philosophy and perspective that you take your entire operations into account. all the way from raw product sourcing to your human resources. So I think leaders do need to create more of a culture that avoids complacency and to start asking, what if this happened? So think about those black swan events that we've seen. So, what happened if another black swan event happened today? How would we plan around that? What kind of forward thinking do we need from our people to start thinking about that? Because that's what really builds resilience is that forward planning and the ability to pivot and be agile when one of those events happens.
Right. So you're challenging business owners today to be more strategic than operational.
Absolutely. The current disruptions, it's actually a rare case now where, they're in the exception rather than the rule. Challenges are actually becoming the norm. And so you have to build in challenges into your operations. Cargoes can't move, inputs don't exist, freight costs are surging. Even among these very operational challenges, strategy is still paramount. We have partner organizations, one partnering organization in particular that watches the oil markets. And they've been modeling what if the Strait of Hormuz was closed for years and years and years. We're being told by politicians that this is a short-term skirmish. What if it's not? And so if no supply chain, it's not as if no supply chain leader couldn't see this coming. So
Yep.
the strategic challenge isn't planning for all risks. It's prioritizing and addressing what makes the most sense and what's most vital for your business.
Yeah, it's interesting to know that, that part of the world, for example, and I commend the company that was doing modeling around that for a while. Like, I'm surprised that countries were like shocked that this sort of situations happen. Yet there's so many other alternatives in that region where you've got other options on the other side to maneuver. Yet you knew you had sort of a very sensitive environment that anything can tip them over. And obviously we're here now where it's been shut down for about what 30, 60, 90 days, and countries are
Yeah,
freaking out, and oil prices are soaring, even though theoretically speaking should be at the cheapest it's been in decades. So it's just all because of a disruption into our supply chain here.
for sure.
you know and I'm interested in finding out one of two things here. So, like, when you talk about leadership and teams, what's separating high performance organizations from the rest today? Where do you see that as being a differentiator?
You definitely see it in the forward planning and the agility. Those are the two things. If you've built systems around contingency planning and can activate a contingency plan quickly and more agilely, you survive better than the rest. So for me, those are the companies that are doing better. Is the ones that are more adaptable to change, that have recognized disruptions in the supply chain, and that actually have done tabletop exercises around those kinds of disruptions.
So, are you seeing a shift in actual talent, or is it more of a leadership style that's being adopted as a whole? Like, are we seeing a generational, new blood, new talent that's bringing in this sort of thought process, or are we all just going and attending courses and learning about all these new variables? Where do you see the biggest shift in that market?
So it's interesting. I have to think about that one because I am from the perspective that you can teach subject matter stuff. So, what organizations should really be looking for is leaders who are a good cultural fit,
Mm.
leaders who have the right kind of attitude, the right kind of can do attitude in particular, the right kind of critical thinking, especially in this era of AI. And then you can train everything else. One organization, I won't mention their name, but one organization during the pandemic was doing really, really well. And to the point where they needed to expand and grow their employee base. And what they were finding is they couldn't find employees that hit both of their criteria, which was subject matter expertise in supply chain and logistics and right cultural fit and right personality. So they actually partnered with us and said, we'll hire for cultural fit. We will hire for right attitude. You train them on logistics as part of their onboarding. So I would say, I don't even want to call them soft skills because it does such a disservice to call business skills soft skills. But I would say those emotional intelligence, business attitude, right mentality, good cultural fit supersede technical skills because technical skills can be taught.
I fully agree with you on that. We almost exclusively hire on EQ versus IQ because at the end of the day, technology in our world is so complicated that most people that we deal with, they're like, I don't understand a word you said, and I don't feel comfortable with what you're selling me or what you're telling me. And so having somebody that's really, empathetic or able to express and explain to the customer what's going to happen and what they're experiencing, that's the key and critical part. We teach them the technical side, and we have the really smart people in the other room that never see a customer because they are not good in communicating. Those soft skills, or what we call EQ skills, are not as prevalent. So we have the same challenge, and we actually try to separate the individuals based on their skill set. So yeah, I fully agree with you on that in that regard. So, looking at what's going on in the marketplace, and we can go in 100 different directions around logistics, and there's been a lot of talk about sustainability both in Canada and across the globe. Do you see that as still part of the check boxes or nice to have, even though we're dealing with all of these other variables, which I think take precedent when businesses are making big decisions? Is that still on the radar today, or are we kind of not seeing that anymore?
It absolutely is still on the radar. In fact, I actually just finished last year a postgrad certificate in sustainability and corporate innovation. It used to be companies thought sustainability is a nice to have. I think what's changed is not only has consumer taste changed, and that's a big one, but larger organizations are actually looking at awarding contracts based on sustainability metrics as part of their RFPs. So I would say that sustainability has gone from a nice to have to an absolute must have. And so I think much like people thought about logistics was that sustainability was a cost, more organizations are now looking at sustainability as a requirement for competitiveness in the new market. So more and more studies are showing that sustainability initiatives create more competition, they create better and more profitable organizations, and the tide is turning on that perspective. Maybe not for our neighbors to the south that have sort of taken a step backward on sustainability, but the rest of the world, Europe in particular, and Canada have made commitments to being net zero and carbon neutral into the future. And so I think the companies that embrace sustainability as an innovative lever for their organizations are the ones that are more competitive, more profitable, and, pardon the pun, more sustainable into the future.
Interesting perspective, because I hear obviously from other sides of the spectrum mixed reviews. And I know that, even with the technology that we sell, it's pretty cool. Some of the packaging that stuff is coming in and how it's being managed and how logistics are, the products are being shipped. Where I'm finding a lot of challenge around it is now they're trying to be more efficient on consolidating shipments and stuff like that. And I think that, as you were talking before about time to market or time to client, is now become elongated because they're trying to fill containers. They're trying to be more efficient in how they're shipping, and they're not shipping just aimlessly as they used to be. And so being more strategic on what they're doing, not just from a packaging perspective. I would love to know what the ratio is between packaging, the actual logistic cost, the fuel cost, the carbon, and all the other variables. People think, oh, it's just about the cardboard box that I'm throwing into the garbage at the end of the line. And I'm like, no, that is like a small piece of the pie. So it's really interesting to see how that plays out.
For sure.
You're talking about companies now really focusing on this, and you're saying the driving factor is more the actual companies that are manufacturing the goods that are pushing the logistic companies, and it's not just regulations and governments. These are corporations like HP and other big companies that are saying, no, we're going to make sure that our products are being sustainably shipped.
Absolutely, especially as more and more companies are looking at their scope 3 emissions. So it used to be companies would only look at their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and those are emissions that a company is directly responsible for creating. What's happened with the focus on scope 3 emissions is these are the emissions from your supply chain. So it's no longer being responsible just for your own operations. It's saying, okay, how does our product get from point A to point B? And what are the inputs that go into that? And now let's look at our entire supply chain and ask the questions of each one of our partners in that supply chain, what they're doing about sustainability. So it actually, I've seen firsthand, it's found its way into all of the RFPs going out. Big, large shipper companies are asking their supply chain what sustainability metrics are they tracking and are they looking at in terms of reducing their overall carbon footprint?
Well, that's great. Great to hear because I think that there's a misconception from the general population is how does that being pushed through from front to back? It's usually almost like an assumption that it's just a piece of the equation. So I'm glad to hear that now this is becoming, and I'm not aware of those what you were just saying about the level one, two, and three.
Yeah,
Wasn't aware of that. I guess general, consumer side of the hence you don't hear about these different levels of compliance and stuff like that. So great to hear that now that new level 3 is kind of kicking in, and all the pieces of the pie from pulling the resources from the ground to producing the product to shipping it all the way to hitting your shelf is being thought through.
for sure. And I think those are what truly sustainable companies look like. They embed sustainability practices into every single part of their operation. So every single employee has a contribution to make, whether it's choosing to bring a recyclable water container to work rather than using water bottles, whether it is going digital to avoid paper consumption, whether it's, moving to geothermal. Like you've got companies that are taking huge and big steps, but it doesn't mean that smaller companies don't have a role to play. Every single person at an organization can actually look at their own operations and how do you pick the low hanging fruit to be more sustainable.
Yeah, I fully agree. I feel that even for a small business like us, like we're making sure that any customer that has e-waste, we don't throw it in the landfill. We're usually taking it to a recycling center for the customer. And that's just one small piece of the equation. And we usually try to be smart about how we dispose of packaging and goods and stuff like that so that it's less impactful to the environment. I
Yeah,
think
and
that
that's
should be go
And
ahead.
and that's Erez, and that's taking a real circular economy perspective. So one of the boards that I sit on is an organization that actually regulates producers. And one of their mission is to create a waste-free Ontario. So how do we look at our operations to remove the diversion to recycling or to garbage, and how do we repurpose our goods so that even the end of life product gets recycled and reintroduced back into that a circular economy. So I very much think we're, as a province, as a country, we're probably a decade into this work. It's important work, but it does find cost savings and it does force companies to be innovative in trying to figure out how they create a product in a circular environment.
Yeah, as long as I think companies are investing in that full circle approach, because I think there was even the city of Toronto and a few municipalities in Canada, I think they got under fire where we don't have enough recycling center facilities. So we collect so many metric tons of garbage every week that's recyclable, but our capacity to actually recycle plastics and whatever or not is like 30% of what we collect.
For
And
sure.
that's a problem. So, how do you balance that equation? Do you either build more recycling facilities or do you push it back to the manufacturers to say you need to use less plastic or materials that could be composted instead and kind of figure out that equation? And it's not just a simple one shoe fits all model because every industry has its own complexities.
For sure.
So, to move that conversation forward, I'd love to know about how technology, since we are a technology company, I'm always intrigued to hear how technology is reshaping the decision of the supply chain world and how that's all being impacted today. What's your insights on
Do I dare become a cliche and talk about AI? I mean,
that?
you can't have a technology discussion without talking about AI, but honestly, it is a technology that is pretty exciting right now. This is the fourth industrial wave, I think, what we're seeing. So, and the capabilities that AI can unleash. So, right now, we're looking at technology generally, but more specifically, when you look at what AI can accomplish, when you look at what organizations are doing in terms of data and data analytics and using AI for predictive data, that's pretty interesting and exciting. When you look at agentic AI, which is the ability to execute tasks. That's pretty exciting right now. Many of our members are warehouses, and the ability to build a digital twin of your warehouse and then explore or scenario play, what if we did this instead of that? And being able to do that in a digital twin before you actually introduce it into a warehouse, that's pretty exciting. Even simple robotics. I know we all get excited about AI, but robotics and introducing robotics into warehouses and what that does in terms of safety and what that does in terms of cost savings. That's also pretty exciting. Blockchain, one of the early adopters of blockchain technology was the supply chain, creating this transparent transaction within a blockchain so that all the vendors could in real time see where their product was and at certain pivot points be able to pay an invoice. I think there are a lot of technologies right now that are pretty exciting and that are shaping supply chains of the future. So lots on the horizon and lots to look out for sure.
Wow, when you put it that way, I didn't even realize all the different variables front to back in respect to that, that kind of impact. Yes, AI, obviously modeling data, intelligence on making decisions, routing efficiencies, all that can be improved exponentially. Cause, I was thinking, okay, last 5 years, you can build some good models, you can build some good Power BI or some sort of call it script to help with that efficiencies. And I've seen some logistics software to help routing. And we've had the GPS world of logistics for over a decade now. But looking at, yeah, robotics, I think, seeing an Amazon warehouse and seeing how warehousing is moving into a robotic AI. I was just at a factory last week where they physically can work without any lights on. Like there's nobody in there, close to 100,000 square foot facility, all CNC, all robotics, from picking up the materials to processing the entire factory. And you get the product at the other end of the assembly line there. And I think there's 2 to 3 people on the entire shop floor.
Yeah,
So
you're absolutely right. I think you mentioned Amazon earlier, but Amazon at its heart is a logistics company.
yes,
We don't realize that, but the reason they're doing so well is they have taken logistics and created a competitive differentiator for them. Think about all the data they collect. Think about how they use that data. And they're now using predictive data that, based on your search history, can predict what you need next and literally order it for you and get it to your door. And they have found that there's a lot less returns with doing that versus not. So I'm pretty excited. I think about Walmart in particular. They just built a state-of-the-art distribution center in Vaughan that
yes.
not only used sustainable principles in how they built that warehouse, but integrated automation, robotics, AI in all aspects of that distribution center. It's pretty exciting.
That's a monstrosity, that building. I ride by it on my bicycle and I'm like, that's got to be like 1 million square feet. It is huge. I've never seen such a building. It's like bigger than an airport. It's so big.
I'm looking
I
forward to getting a tour of it.
You'll have to give me a call. I'd
Yeah,
enjoyed piggybacking on that one. I'll be a dust in the wind type of thing. I just want to see what it looks like on the inside.
for
Yeah,
sure.
it's interesting. Like, when we look at it, we talk about had this in a few other conversations. We talk about like where do people fit in on this equation? And I'm interested in your perspective because obviously last week I think Tesla announced that their autonomous Cybertrucks or their Cybertrucks are coming out and that should reduce, personnel in the truck or requirement with full self-driving. I think Volvo and a few other manufacturers are coming out with call it not only EV trucks, but self-driving vehicles. We've seen forklifts, we've seen warehousing and different types of systems. Are you seeing now this plan to reduce headcount and that physical labor? You talked about health and safety there. Do you see this sort of becoming a bigger shift towards robotics and automation than it is today?
I think it would be naive not to think there's going to be an impact on our labor force. I do think that some jobs will become redundant and removed. And it's probably, the lower, unsafe jobs, repetitive task jobs. So that's probably overall not necessarily a bad thing for our economy. I think the jobs are definitely going to change. So you're going to need people who are tech savvy. You are going to need people who understand the data that you're being fed. So I'm taking a course right now on AI for business transformation. And the general theme of that course is that jobs will change. Some jobs will be displaced, but you are always going to need people in the loop. You're always going to need critical thinking in the loop. We've seen over the last number of years that AI is not perfect yet. AI has the ability to hallucinate. AI has the ability to come up with data that just doesn't fit the context. And we call those, humans in the loop. So the individuals that I think that are going to be sought after in the future are individuals who are the middle person between the AI solution and the business need. So who are those leaders who understand the business need and can validate what the AI solution is telling them that they need? So I definitely think jobs are going to change. Definitely would encourage people to get familiar with AI. How does AI work? Where are the gaps in AI? What are the governance risks with respect to AI? But I do think that it is a technology that is already doing revolutionary things in our industry, and that, for better or worse, it's here to stay. And so how do we train people in those skills? So I'm going to give the CITT an early plug. We've certainly seen the trend, and we're actually creating a course on how to integrate AI into logistics. And so it's going to have a number of modules. It'll look at AI and data that's generated from a transportation management system or a warehouse management system. And how do people look at that data or generate that data? How do you prompt to be able to get the answers that you need? Okay, so then, I will say that I think it's naive to think that there won't be some job loss and some job displacement, but it'll typically be the jobs that are repetitive, task oriented, probably unsafe. And that's a good thing, to bring in robotics to replace those kinds of jobs. I think that the jobs of the future will be the jobs of individuals who are able to take and be the go between the AI solution or tool and the business need and the business solution. So I think that it will definitely change our workforce, and there is going to be a need to reskill and upskill individuals for sure. And one of the things that the CITT is doing is we've recognized this trend, and we are creating some courses to actually train individuals in logistics and how it can actually help you in your jobs.
Yeah, and I think in the past, looking at the last several years, there was a supply chain issue of just the talent to drive trucks. And looking at a lot of the people that were being brought in to do the truck driving and the logistics side of things, doesn't matter when you look at it, from even airplanes and other forms of transportation, a lot of people were brought in, call it foreign workers, were brought in to fill those roles because it wasn't a desirable position, even though it was a well-paid position. There was just no interest in it. It's kind of like how trades have become sort of like a new trendy job to have. Everybody was looking at technology. And I agree with you on the other aspect of, that convergence point. When I see it, look at the military. So today, military now flies drones and, unmanned resources, planes, drones, whatever it is, and they've got people in comm rooms playing video games with real devices, like, if you really think about it, right? So what's going to change if we get to a point where you have a comm room where several people are sitting in a comm room and there's 100 trucks or vehicles in logistics all autonomously moving from A to B? And then if there is a, let's call it, predictive episode or predictive security or whatever, not, that person's sitting in a comm room with the TV goes red, that person can now manually take over the steering wheel or at least interface with that. I can see that almost becoming like a air traffic control system where all these vehicles are being managed by a call center type of thing and nobody's sitting in the truck anymore. So it's maybe not next year, but I can see definitely in the next 10 years where we're in that direction. And the technology will be mature enough to say that, yeah, I don't need to be driving if I'm doing 10 hours a highway. And I'm not now worried about, the driver falling asleep at 3 in the morning and weaving off the highway, as much as they're trying to enforce logbooks and safety and all that other stuff. Now it's more efficient. There's some reliability, and theoretically the driver could be sleeping in the back and you have full autonomous driving taking you to the next morning, and the person's a lot safer that way. So there's going to be an interesting intersection point with that
Yeah.
whole
Yeah, it's pretty
technology realm.
scary, isn't it? And I will say that the technology's there. The technology has been there already for years. It's that we're not ready for it, from a regulatory perspective, from an infrastructure perspective. And so the technology exists. We could be fully autonomous in the air, fully autonomous in vehicles,
Yep.
except that's pretty scary. And I don't know that we're quite ready for, a plane without a pilot in it. So it'll change the job. I think we'll probably still have a pilot in there overseeing it. It just gives us comfort, or at least it gives me comfort, I have to say. So it's not a matter of the technology not being there. Technology is there and exists. I don't think we're ready as a society yet for that. So we got a lot of catch up to do to be able to catch up to the technology.
Yeah, especially for our generation. I think maybe the younger generation, the 10-year-olds, the 8-year-olds, there's already conversation that they may never grow up driving a vehicle because by then autonomous driving will be fully embedded and they'll be like, why do I need a driver's license? I can get into, I'll own my vehicle, but I'll just tell it like the Jetsons, take me to work and it's my
Right,
car.
right.
So, it's an interesting one. I can tell you when I bought my Tesla and I got the full self-driving activated, it was nerve-wracking going through
Mhm.
intersections and changing lanes, and it did have its moments in the beginning. I would say 2 years ago, it wasn't perfect, especially in countryside roads. It did not know how to handle where there was no lines in the road and certain things on the side of the road. So that was definitely scary, but conventional roads where there's stop signs and street lights and in the city, I can see why it's appealing to sit there, turn it on, and read your news and get to your office stress free and not have to think about why am I stuck in traffic. So
Yeah, and the transition period is gonna be interesting, right? Because
yeah,
at some point we may get there, right? Whether it's 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we're gonna get to a place where perhaps we are fully autonomous. But think about the transition where we've got half autonomous versus half human-led vehicles, and what does that look like? So I definitely think it's this transition period that is gonna be the most interesting to watch.
yeah, for sure. It will definitely be an interesting generational shift, and it won't happen overnight because people will still hold on to their steering wheels and your truck drivers are still going to hold on to their trucks, and you know I think we'll introduce some of the conveniences and eventually it'll be phased in. And just like Spotify and Apple Music didn't take over the music industry overnight, we're still buying CDs and records for many years. And eventually we're like, just listen to it on a streaming network. I don't need to go and buy this now. I think it's been like 10 years since I bought my last record. So it's like,
Yeah,
it's more trendy now that you have this vinyl than it is a necessity.
for sure.
So CITT, like you guys have been around for quite some time. You're an important part of the industry. What do you guys how do you guys see how do you see the organization now moving forward to helping businesses and companies be more adaptive? That you're mentioning about a program. Is that the role of CITT in the sense of being the forefront on how to deal with all of these challenges as we're moving forward? Give us a little bit more insight.
Yeah, for sure. I absolutely do believe that. I think as a logistics association, and one of our primary mandates is training. So we look at all of these changes ahead and how can we be training the next generation of talent or the current generation of talent. So we want to be able to enable even the most junior logistics person to have a baseline of the competencies needed to drive competitive logistics operations. And that goes all the way to the top. So we want to be able to connect different parts of the supply chain together. We want to be part of investing in talent. I think the organizations that invest in their talent, human capital is the most important resource that every single company has. And so as these changes are occurring, how do we continue to invest in training, whether it's upskilling or reskilling that talent? I think that's a key role that the CITT can play, especially for our supply chain and logistics professionals.
And do you see more certifications and requirements coming out in light of all these new, call it processes and technologies coming into hold? You were talking about obviously sustainability. Like, do you see more of those certifications and requirements coming into effect?
So definitely, organizations are actually looking for a trust mark. We want to hire individuals that have competency-based learning. And I think that's the difference between a university or a college diploma or degree and an industry designation. An industry designation is based on a competency profile. So what are the competencies that logistics professionals need to have? And the CITT trains. So we work quite closely with industry to figure out what those are, and we train individuals to have those competencies. So number one, I think that's important. The other thing that I think organizations like the CITT could be doing is looking at what is required in terms of upskilling. So micro credentials is a big trend right now. Don't give me the big, year long training requirement. I need individuals trained in 2 weeks on this specific thing that's coming out, whether it's AI, whether it's sustainability, whether it's a new technology, whether it's a new way to do things. And so I think the CITT has to itself become adaptable and agile and start looking at what those gaps and competencies are and find quick ways to train individuals in those gaps. I think that's the biggest value that we can add to the supply chain industry in Canada.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'm seeing that the rate of change and pace of change, especially when we're looking at technology, it's sometimes hard to predict and commit to a 1 year program when the rate of change is happening every 30, 60, 90 days, especially with AI now. Kind of, I don't say it has a proper established foothold, but it's impacting the decisions that business owners are making on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
And I don't think until it settles down, I think that's going to be the big variable, right? Like once everything establishes that this is how it's affected the industry, then we can build around that. But till that time happens, it's kind of like everyone's throwing spaghetti on the wall or throwing a dart on the wall and trying to figure out what their next move is. And that's pretty hard to navigate when you're a small business or even a large corporation and you've got all these variables impacting your business. So do you guys also work as an advocacy, or do you kind of like help bring in the new technologies and all this and distill it down to your membership base, or how does
So we
that
don't
take into
actually do
effect?
advocacy. That's the one thing that we don't do. So
Okay.
we do training and development. We administer designations, competency-based designations. We try to bring people together within the supply chain to making sure that we're all working together for the greater good and the biggest economic impact. But we don't do advocacy. So there are other associations that absolutely do that. And we definitely have interactions with government. So we're part of task force. When the National Supply Chain Office was created to look at how do we create a more resilient Canadian supply chain. We were certainly involved in that. So it's not to say that we don't have interactions with government, but we don't actually do advocacy as part of our mandate.
Well, for all the business owners there that are out in manufacturing, logistics, and stuff like that, Pina, why don't you give us a little bit of sort of like a final remarks about, the organization and what's coming, what they should be aware of, and maybe a little bit of a plug if you want to give yourself one. I'd love to just give you that opportunity to talk about it and sort of finish the show this way.
For sure. Well, for all of those organizations looking for training and development, looking for ways to stand out as employers, looking for ways to invest in their people, yes, come to CITT. Like we offer all sorts of courses, whether they're micro credentials or whether they're longer designations. So if you're looking at that, please check out the CITT. What I will say is sort of forward looking and closing comments is, I don't think we're done with disruption in the supply chain. I think it's going to be a hectic few years ahead. But as long as Canada continues to look at how we can be more resilient, I'm pretty optimistic about what the future looks like. I think about our current government's vision for increasing intra Canada trade, for cutting red tape, for diversifying our international relationships. I think that bodes well for a stronger internal supply chain. And I think that's going to be great for both Canadian consumers as well as the Canadian logistics industry,
Well, I think I would love to have you back on that conversation alone, which I think right off the bat could be a full hour
for sure.
talking about Canadian trade and how that needs to be evolved. So, but I do want to thank you for coming out to our show today, Pina. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit more about logistics.
Excellent. And to all our listeners, thank you for listening. If you'd like, please like and subscribe. We're always looking for amazing new speakers. If you're interested, please feel reach out. Otherwise, Peanut, thank you for your time. Have yourself a great day, everybody, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you. Thanks.